Doctor, now to start with, you have talked a lot about new regional architecture, new regional trade architecture in your research. Now, as the OBOR coming in, how do you see this new regional architecture within the context of OBOR?
You see, I think the first point that we need to keep in mind is that the One Belt, One Road is coming up in a part of the world which has an enormous number of free trade agreements and regional trade agreements across it. For a large variety of reasons, all of which are correct. Asia has often been referred to as the noodle bowl in terms of the regional trade agreements that it has. I think the challenge for One Belt, One Road will be to ensure that rather than contradicting, it complements the existing regional trade architecture and facilitates it. The challenge that might come up is, and let me illustrate by giving an example, all the various free trade agreements, whether they are bilateral or regional, they have a segment to them which are called the rules of origin. These rules of origin mean that between the parties that sign an agreement, goods can move from one party to another or among the parties for getting the benefit of preferential market access, that is low tariff or zero tariff. Under very select conditions are these goods allowed to go through a third country when they are being shipped. Now the challenge for OBOR is that supposing there is a country within the One Belt, One Road, let's say for example Sri Lanka, which is not a part of the existing regional trade architecture, let us say between Southeast Asia and another country, let's say India, which is also a part of the geography. The point is that if exporters want to use Sri Lanka and the facilities that develops in Sri Lanka following One Belt, One Road, whether that will still enable them to get the benefit of one or more particular free trade agreements that they belong to. Now, this is where it becomes extremely important that China, as the leader of the One Belt, One Road initiative, and along with the partners that it works with, takes care to ensure that the One Belt, One Road initiative does not come into conflict with these agreements, because there are new and new agreements that are coming up. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is coming up. We have just had the European Union and Japan concluding a free trade agreement. There are more agreements that are in the pipeline. So regional trade agreements are going to be a reality. Free trade agreements, bilaterally or otherwise, are going to be a reality, much as there is controversy over the benefits of trade. But this is a movement that is not going to stop. So the One Belt, One Road as a connectivity initiative must complement, and it has to proceed after taking stock of the rules, conditions, benefits and facilities of various trade agreements.
Now, when we talk about Sri Lanka has a problem of low trade ratio. Sri Lanka's export to GDP ratio has been going down, and in that context, Sri Lanka is in the process of negotiating three free trade agreements: China, Singapore and Thailand. Now, within the OBOR and within this new regional architecture, what are the areas that Sri Lanka should primarily be focusing on?
I think, in a sense, the fact that Sri Lanka has now left behind a period of inward-looking policies and is looking ahead to outward orientation and more open trade policies is interesting, because this is the time when Asia is undergoing fundamental changes. We have had the One Belt, One Road coming up. We have had also other connectivity initiatives gathering momentum, like the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. And in all these, if one takes a look at the geography, Sri Lanka occupies a very important position, because Sri Lanka is in a number of ways the conduit between Europe and Asia for the very busy shipping traffic that covers this route. Sri Lanka is the conduit. So what is important for Sri Lanka is to take a look at the way these developments are coming up and to respond as effectively as it can by picking and choosing the trade agreements which will get for it the maximum benefits. And to that extent, there are challenges involved because it's just not enough to get into trade agreements for the sake of getting in there, because those could be counterproductive. It's important to remember that trade agreements are no more just about goods. Modern trade agreements are very exhaustively about services, about investment, and most importantly, about digitalization and technology. There are going to be very large implications for electronic commerce and online business, and modern trade agreements cover all these things. So I think it's very important for Sri Lanka and its agencies and its actors to take careful stock of the OBOR and connectivity game on one hand, and the fact that it is living in a world where trade agreements are mushrooming, and combine these two to maximize its very important geostrategic location. Sri Lanka's location is fantastic, and it is in a right position to exploit this with all these developments around it.
Now, you talked about Sri Lanka's location and its importance. Singapore is a great example which uses location for its advantage. Sri Lanka, on the other hand, has not really used its location for advantage. So, going from here, particularly with the availability of OBOR, what kind of a reforms or what kind of a policies that we require in order to get into these value chains?
That, I think, is an extremely important question. You see, if you look at the One Belt, One Road and the geography that it canvasses, it covers Europe, it covers Asia, it also covers Africa. So there are parts of 3 continents that are coming in here. It extends from the East China Sea and parts of the Pacific, then the Indian Ocean, Bay of Bengal, Arabian Sea, Persian Gulf into the Mediterranean. So it's very large amounts of geographical spaces that we are talking about. And this entire geography has countries which are economically very different. They're not only different in terms of their resources, they're different in terms of their capacities. There are some regions like parts of Europe and Southeast Asia, parts of Southeast Asia and East Asia, which are much more integrated with the world economy than the others, and notably South Asia and Africa. Now, these countries will be in a comparatively better position to make use of the One Belt, One Road's new infrastructure as compared with the others. So the challenge for the countries that are less integrated is now to improve their capabilities and to bring those to a level which is reasonably close to that of the front runners. And to that extent, the challenge is domestic. So domestic infrastructure has to improve. Costs of doing business has to come down. Facilities in doing cross-border movement of goods and services must improve. Trade facilitation has to improve. So these are challenges which the countries that are lagging behind must take on, because otherwise they will continue to remain behind the countries that are ahead of them in capacity.
Now, since you talked about the trade facilitation, Sri Lanka ranked as 110 in the Ease of Doing Business Index, which is not a good place to be. Now, when we again looking at trade facilitation and the importance of getting into trade agreements and being a part of the OBOR, what kind of actions that the government can take in order to move up ranking of the Ease of Doing Business Index and increase board efficiency and etc.?
You know, when we look at issues that influence trade facilitation, there are 2 ways in which one can look at it, or rather 2 boxes that one can visualize. One is trade facilitation on the border, where one comes across simple basic issues like, say for example, invoicing practices, customs efficiency, the ease with which goods can move in and out of ports and airports. I think when it comes to these category of issues, Sri Lanka is doing quite well. And particularly the New Colombo port, which is a major mega transshipment hub, and now is capable of taking big containers of more than 18,500 MT, is an excellent example. But the bigger challenge is on trade facilitation, which is beyond the border. And when I say beyond the border, the specific issues that I have on my mind is transportation of goods from one part of the country, let us say to the hinterland to the coast, which depends very actively on the domestic infrastructure, on the practices, invoicing, business familiarization, and the knowledge that professionals have with respect to trade agreements and external financing facilities. I think that is where the provinces and the federal government, industry and agencies have to work together to ensure that this becomes a win-win situation.
I'm coming back to your arguments about this new regional trade architecture. Now we know that now TPP is like almost out since US backed down from it. Do you think that the fact that US came out of the TPP, does this have an influence on the new regional architecture, or how would this change the trade dynamics of the world?
Well, the TPP obviously with 11 countries without the US, it's certainly not going to be the same as it would have been with the US, because the economic size of the TPP reduces considerably. The appeal of other members negotiating the TPP, which came into the TPP primarily because of their interest in getting preferential access to the US market, countries like Malaysia and Vietnam, would obviously, and they have variously expressed their disappointment in this regard. But having said that, even without the US, the TPP 11 is now trying to move ahead under the leadership of Japan and Australia. Now, what that means is that there is a reconciliation to the fact that US might not anymore give leadership to regional trade. Well, if that is the case, then the region and the world must accept it. And there has to be other alternative leaderships from other countries that are coming up. So maybe it could be Japan, maybe it could be other countries. The important thing is the TPP puts in place certain rules and standards which are very significant and path-breaking as far as modern trade is concerned. Now, if the TPP is able to resurrect, or even if other trade agreements pick up these lessons from the TPP and incorporate them within themselves, like say for example, the NAFTA negotiations might incorporate a part of the TPP. There might be other regional trade agreements which might pick up bits and pieces from TPP chapters in various respects. Then I think that TPP would be a success, and the TPP's influence on regional and global trade would continue to remain significant.
Now, just to wrap up, Professor, Sri Lanka is currently in the process of formulating its trade policy. Particularly in light of trade agreements and the OBOR funding and etc. What are the areas that we primarily need to focus on, ensure that the country gets benefited in the long run, since it's a policy that matters for probably for decades?
Let me allude to 3 points here. I think the first point is that historically Sri Lanka was one of those countries which was much ahead of other countries in taking outward-oriented open trade policies. Way back in the 1970s, it did it when much of the world was thinking about trade very differently. It's a different matter that Sri Lanka could not capitalize on those because of a large number of issues. But today, when a new national trade policy is being formed, I find it a very interesting document, but I also note that there is a degree of caution in taking this document forward, because along with a recognition of the need that trade has to become a very important engine of growth for an economy like Sri Lanka, there is an equal realization of the fact that there are adjustment costs from trade. And I think this is basically in reference to the global debate that we have seen over the last 1 to 1.5 years, where trade is being victimized for a large number of social problems that have taken place in many parts of the world, particularly the developed world. So I think there is a recognition of the fact that trade needs to be calibrated. The gains from certain segments of the economy need to be balanced by compensating potential losers on the other side. But the problem over here is, or more specifically the challenge over here is, that how does one do it? You see, I think this is an issue which is a matter of concern all over the world, that globalization or free trade are not by themselves equalizing processes. They are unbalanced and to an extent distortionary. So how does one balance this? And I don't think there's a straightforward answer to this. I think each country, depending upon its social, economic and political conditions, need to address this in their own specific ways. My hope is, I shouldn't say hope, I am confident that Sri Lanka is a country which has a great tradition, history of learning and wisdom. And I think Sri Lanka will be able to handle this. If Sri Lanka cannot handle this challenge, very few countries of the world will be able to.
Thank you very much for joining us, It's a pleasure talking to you.
Welcome.